I call the member for Kooyong.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I rise to support the Nuclear Terrorism Legislation Amendment Bill 2011, which will give effect to our obligations under the International Convention for the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism. This will create new criminal offences for 1. Possessing or making radioactive material, nuclear explosive devices, or a device to emit material with radiological properties which may cause death, serious bodily injury or substantial damage to property or the environment. 2. Using or damaging a convention-prescribed device or nuclear facility, or threatening to do so. 3. Threatening to use radioactive material. 4. Demanding another person create radioactive material, a convention-prescribed device or a nuclear facility. And 5. Demanding another person allow a third person to access or control radioactive material, a convention device or a nuclear facility. Mr Deputy Speaker, importantly, offences under this bill include serious penalties, up to 20 years imprisonment, and that members of our Australian Defence Force will not be liable for prosecution under this convention when acting in connection with the defence and security of Australia, nor does this convention cover actions of the armed forces during armed conflict. Mr Deputy Speaker, like my colleague and friend before me, I subscribe to the view that nuclear terrorism is our greatest security threat. One of the foremost authorities on this topic is Professor Graham Allison, a former US Assistant Secretary of Defence in the Clinton administration and now Director of the Belfer Centre at the Harvard University Kennedy School of Government, where I was a student and where I got to know Professor Allison well. Professor Allison sees the nuclear threat as entirely possible and points to the findings of a bipartisan United States Congressional Commission on the Prevention of Weapons of Mass Destruction, Proliferation and Terrorism, which found, and I quote, "It is more likely than not that a weapon of mass destruction will be used in a terrorist attack somewhere in the world by the end of 2013. Professor Allison and this bipartisan Congressional Commission are not the only ones to point to the seriousness of this threat. President Obama has said nuclear terrorism is the single most important national security threat that we face. And in his first speech to the United Nations Security Council as President, he said, and I quote, "Just one nuclear weapon exploded in a city, be it New York or Moscow, Tokyo or Beijing, London or Paris, could kill hundreds of thousands of people." And he went on to say, "destabilising our security, our economies and our way of life." Former United States CIA Director George Tenet has said, and I quote, "The main threat is a nuclear one. I am convinced that that is where bin Laden and al-Qaeda and his operatives desperately want to go." Former US Defence Secretary Robert Gates has said, "It's the thought of a terrorist ending up with a weapon of mass destruction, especially nuclear, which keeps him up at night." Mr Deputy Speaker, indeed we were given a glimpse into the causes for this deep concern expressed by the leaders of the United States military and security establishment through the WikiLeaks revelations, which published some of the files of those captured in Guantanamo. The Telegraph newspaper in the United Kingdom, in its reporting of these WikiLeaks reports, said, and I quote, A senior Al-Qaeda commander claimed that the terrorist group has hidden a nuclear bomb in Europe, which will be detonated if bin Laden is ever caught or assassinated. The US authorities uncovered numerous attempts by Al-Qaeda to obtain nuclear materials and fear that terrorists have already bought uranium. Sheikh Mohammed told interrogators that Al-Qaeda would unleash a nuclear hellstorm. It went on, and I quote, to say that terrorists also plotted major chemical and biological attacks against this country. Mr. Deputy Speaker, Professor Graham Allison believes that despite the reality and pervasiveness of this threat, Americans are paralysed by, a combination of denial and fatalism. That if it hasn't happened, it won't, or if it does happen, we can do nothing to stop it. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the truth is we can. We can do something to mitigate this threat, to stop such an atrocity ever happening. We can strengthen our intelligence agencies, as the Howard government did, and I was proud to be involved in that process, supporting ASIO and the Australian Federal Police when I was in the office of John Howard. We can strengthen our legislative processes, which is part of today's bill before us. We can attract the best people. We can share information with our friends and our allies in order to get the best result. There is a way forward. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there is a reality that we all have to face, and that is, in Australia, the terrorist threat is ever so real. In a very important speech to the Sydney Institute, David Irvine, who's the head of ASIO, has revealed exactly the depth of today's threat. He pointed out that over 100 Australians have been killed in terrorist attacks overseas since 9/11, and he said that he did not share the view that the terrorist threat is either over-exaggerated or that it just happens in another country. In fact, David Irvine, who is one of our finest diplomats, he had been our ambassador in China and heavily involved in security, David Irvine has said that in Australia, 23 individuals in recent years have been handed very heavy penalties for terrorist attacks. And he said in his words, "It is worth reading the sentencing statements of the Australian judges to get an idea of the seriousness with which they viewed the offences and the likely consequences had they been successful." David Irvine went on to say, and I quote, "ASIO continues to conduct several hundred counter-terrorism investigations and inquiries, ranging from Australians in contact with terrorists offshore, including Al-Qaeda, to possible threats to Australian interests or Australian lives from extremist activity either on or offshore." He went on to say, and I quote, "Within the Australian environment, we are seeing a worrying trend of homegrown terrorism. This is not an abstract or an offshore threat. It is real and it is among us. Worryingly too," he said, "we are continuing to see a number of Australians seeking to travel overseas for participation in or facilitation of terrorism-related activities. My concern is that such people may target innocent people overseas, assist those who would do harm to our nation, or might return to Australia with a greater knowledge, training and intent to carry out an act of terrorism back home." Mr. Deputy Speaker, these are very profound, disturbing and important words. We can do something to stop the terrorist threat. We can do something to stop the nuclear threat. The first thing we can do is we can stop countries with existing nuclear capacity, like Pakistan and North Korea, proliferating their technology and their capacity to other countries. The second thing we can do is we can stop countries that currently do not have a nuclear device, like Iran and Syria and Burma, from ever getting one. And thirdly, we can tackle terrorism with a robust security framework and our deep alliances with our neighbours and friends. And fourth, we can introduce tough legislation that actually makes it an offence to do the type of activities which I've outlined today. Mr Deputy Speaker, the Nuclear Terrorism Legislation Amendment Bill 2011 is an important part of our arsenal. It's an important part of Australia's defence. I support it unequivocally, and so do my many colleagues on the coalition side. Thank you.